Welcome to Courageous Conversations with Lionheart Coaching Co., where we talk about the hard parts of our journey and the courage it can sometimes take to find our way back to ourselves. I'm your host, Mandie Woodard, and on this episode, we're going to talk about men and healing, the stigma, the journey, and how we can change things. And I have an extra special treat for you because my husband is here to chime in and share his perspective. All right, let's get started. Hi, friends. I'm so excited to introduce to you my first ever guest on Courageous Conversations. And I also have to say a big thank you because this is really not something that's his thing. He's so supportive, but being in the spotlight is not his first choice.
Very true.
So everybody, this is my husband, Richie Woodard.
Hello, I'm honored to be the first guest on the show. I'm excited.
I thought before we started talking about anything that I would kind of share a little bit about our story of how we met and came to be. Only because it has so much of my intuition wrapped up in it, and that's something that I really talk about on the show. So I don't know if you can recall it. Do you remember the day we met?
Only because you talk about it often. But
It was a significant day in my life, Richie.
yes, that's correct. It was a significant day in your life.
So we met, we were introduced by a mutual friend, and a fire drill happened. We were in high school, and a fire drill happened, and we had to go out front to stand, and we were getting in trouble because we wouldn't stop joking with each other back and forth. You do not remember that?
I do not.
Okay, so that's how we met, and then it wasn't for a couple months later that we started dating. And the reason why it's significant for me is that I felt this pull to you that I was trying to ignore.
I felt a pull as well.
Shut up. But then this man breaks up with me. So we started dating, and then he breaks up with me. And I remember telling a friend that it just didn't feel right. It didn't make sense because I intuitively felt like you were supposed to be my husband. And I was like, I can't even believe that I am saying this. At 16 years old, I couldn't believe I was saying that. But I felt it really, really strongly. And I wanted to say that because I'm going to talk about this a lot. When you know things, you just know things. And that was one of the things I just knew. So...
Yeah, well, we'll kind of get into it, but it's kind of funny because looking back, not being allowed or not being able to really translate how I was feeling or my emotions, it was just easier to break up with you in my mind. So I'm sure that played a part.
Man, that was a perfect segue.
You're welcome. I know.
Because,
I just thought of that too.
I didn't even think about that as a teenage boy,
Yeah.
not really being able to articulate your feelings.
Yeah.
All right, so really what we're supposed to be talking about today is men and the stigma, the healing journey, all of the things. But the first question that I ever thought of to ask you to hit on is, when did you first realize that the man up mentality, that man up, suck it up, deal with it, was toxic or unhelpful?
I'd say being a dad and having a son, playing multiple sports, he's always been very active. And growing up, concussions, as I graduated in 2004 and we never really talked about or had heard about concussions. It was always just, get back in the game and play through it or man up or tough it out. And I'd really say a vivid memory of mine is when I was coaching our son in football, and he was only, 7 or 8 at the time, could hardly hold up his helmet, and seen him smack the ground while trying to make a tackle, and I instinctively told him, get up, you're fine, get back in the game. And really just reflecting on that after the fact and after the game, and just kind of realizing that that was not the right approach. And perspective is everything, but kind of looking back and just trying to understand why my first reaction was to tell him to man up. And, even though I didn't use those words, essentially that's what I was saying, to man up and get back in the game. And to this day, that still kind of doesn't really sit well with me. I feel also at the same time that's kind of what kind of made me rethink and change my perspective on that old school mentality of, man up and just fight through it.
Yeah, because you're talking about in terms of sports, which I think is important. That was great. I didn't even know that story.
Yeah.
But what about it? What I was thinking too is the way that ended up transferring over into feelings and emotions. Because, you married somebody who's highly sensitive. You had children who are highly sensitive.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what goes into it. There are no feelings or emotions. It's just easier to say man up.
Yeah.
It's much easier to just say that than actually think about feelings or the effect that may have. And going back and thinking, it does make you feel tough that you can man up and push through it. And, sometimes, I'm not going to lie, sometimes it is necessary. And finding that balance is probably the hardest thing as a dad. And even being the husband of a intuitive / sensitive spouse, finding that balance to tell the other to push through it or to quote unquote man up, it's tough. But at the end of the day, I really, as a father, I thought to myself, when does that actually work? How is that effective in the long run?
That's a good thought.
Correct.
Well, too, I first remember us really talking about that phrase after you'd watched a documentary. But is that a different time than what you're talking about?
It all kind of runs together, but again, it's not really the documentary and the statistics and the details that the documentary gives, but it's just a perspective shift. Because again, naturally we just say man up or get over it or tough it out, and there really is no thought or emotion. You just you just instinctively say it.
Yeah, and why do we instinctively say it?
Well, that's where the perspective change and the shift has to happen. Just for generations, men have been taught to suppress feelings, and
yeah, it's conditioning.
Yeah, and society doesn't. It's better now, obviously, than it was before, but society doesn't really allow that. And
I still don't think society allows that.
No, we're having this conversation, so it is getting better.
It is, yes.
And this documentary kind of points in that direction, but the documentary, I can't recall the name. It was actually a feminist who was, she was a feminist. She was completely against men's rights, and she started following this group of men who in her eyes were completely in the wrong. And just the way that again, perspective is everything. Perspective and experiences, they're the greatest teacher. But she followed this group of men, and she's very honest and open going into this documentary about what her objective was with following the group of men. And she starts learning about the suppression of feelings and the avenues that they just don't have. Yeah. She starts, this documentary kind of dives into the suicide rate and why the suicide rate is just astronomically higher as opposed to women. Watching that documentary, the timing of it I can't recall, but that and kind of taking on the role as a father and trying to figure out what I can do just on my end with the kids, and
to make the change,
just letting them know that it is okay to be vulnerable and it is okay to express feelings no matter what society tells you. It's completely acceptable.
Yeah. I remember when you called me from work to tell me about that documentary, because I thought, how lucky am I that my husband's going to get it, that you're getting it, because mental health has been something that's been very much, I don't know, a huge chunk of my life, because I've had so much to work through. Just having given my childhood and traumas and things that have happened in my life, it's been a focus for me. And so when I started to see things happening in our marriage or with our kids, I wanted to be able to work through things. And a lot of men, I don't want to like generalize, but I mean, that is why we're having this conversation. A lot of men are scared to seek therapy, or scared to go have counseling, or they just think that it makes them look weak.
Yeah, it's that. And like I said, because we're conditioned to not really be open or express how we feel. I think we hope that it'll just go away, or it'll fade away. The emotions that we're suppressing will just go away over time. That's just not the case. It becomes heavier, and it builds and builds and builds.
Whenever I first presented to you the idea of going to counseling, whether it was for us, for our marriage, or for even as a family, to like for our kids, was that an easy no-brainer? Like, yes, let's go, or did you struggle with that?
Struggled with that. I struggle with that personally.
Do you still, or do you feel like that you're past that?
No, I mean, I still feel that those feelings, and it's almost a feeling of guilt, or maybe your ego getting in the way of counseling. But yeah, it's definitely still there. It's not completely gone.
Yeah.
It's not something that happens overnight.
Yeah. I think that's huge to though admit that, and then put it out there that it's hard. It's hard to walk in and get any type of counseling or therapy. And that's not the only path to healing. I have talked about that previously on another episode. There are other ways. But let's talk about pushing away those emotions. I had this come up in a session with one of my male clients this week, and he talked about putting it in a box on the shelf, and putting it in a box on the shelf, and it gets to the point where the shelf becomes too heavy, there's no more room, and it falls over. And I feel like that is what happens. Let me just push this over here. Let me just do this instead, and not actually sitting with the feelings that are coming up, or figuring out the root of whatever it is that's triggering you. And then all of a sudden we have this massive explosion. Not to say that you massively explode, but I don't think that it's unreasonable to say that, because I think back in the day, that is what happened. We both were erupting left and right when we were first starting our family, because we didn't know how to process or communicate.
Yeah, I think my lack of communication skills, and just not being confident enough to be vulnerable with you, let alone anyone, and explaining how I felt, or trying to even understand how I felt at that time, really played a significant part.
That's interesting to say, not confident enough. Because I think that that's all, I don't know. I don't like to make it super men versus women, but boys really do. That confidence and talking about how you feel, and not being judged, or even having the words to articulate how you're feeling.
Or appearing weak.
I'm curious though about the weak thing. Like, how did you feel like it would appear weak?
Because at 20 years old, in my mind, I was still a kid. I was still navigating through becoming a man, and being a father, and being a, not necessarily a spouse at the time, but having a significant other. And those things require constant communication, and just the need for transparency and understanding one another's feelings. And I just mentally was not mature enough for that, or prepared for that.
I mean, fair enough. I don't know many 20-year-olds that would be at that point. But we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, I think, back then, too, to have it figured out because we'd already started our family.
Yeah, and looking back, we already had it figured out in our minds. Like, we already,
Yeah.
At 20 years old, you already
think
know everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. What do you struggle with mentally? Like, what are some mental struggles you have now?
Well, something I think about often, and I would say is probably my biggest struggle, is just trying not to repeat the generational pattern of telling kids to man up or just to get over whatever it is they're not wanting to push through or whatever feelings they're wrapped up in at that moment.
Yeah.
And there just needs to be a balance of knowing when to push and when to just, even as a parent, to just shut up and listen. And there's a difference between healthy push and maybe a not so healthy push. And it's really hard as a parent to determine when is the right time for either of those.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that's a really good point to bring up because part of this learning curve for all of us right now is, well, we have to shift it with that next generation coming up. So when do we push and when do we not? So a not would be when your kid gets his head rocked on the football field. You tell him to get up, suck it up, keep going.
To push through it, yeah. That again, that was an unhealthy push, and that's probably why I brought it up now and still think about it to this day.
All right, well, tell me an example of a healthy push.
An example would be when I took the boys camping at Seneca Rocks, West Virginia, with my brother-in-law, and they were both terrified at the end of our hike to go. We had made it 95% of the hike, and the last little 5% of the hike was up a semi-steep hill and a look over, and they locked up and they did not want to do it. But I just knew that finishing that hike and the gratification and the lead up to that hike, I just knew it was going to be well worth it. So I did. In my mind, it was a healthy push. I did push them
to finish.
Yeah, to finish the hike and to go to the overlook and look over. And I'll just never forget just how excited and just the look on their face. And
yeah.
I mean, and more than anything, just of how confident and proud they were that they completed the hike and were able to finish what we started earlier that day and had talked about, days leading up to the hike.
Yeah. Well, I think it's about teaching your kids that they can do hard things in a healthy way. I was thinking about the example from this past summer. Our son decides he wants to play football again, and practices are early every morning. And that first week comes along and he's like, yeah, I'm too tired. I don't want to go. And I was kind of on the side of, yeah, he's really tired. Let's let him sleep.
He deserves a break.
Yeah. So I came downstairs and told you, and you were like, he's made this commitment. We have to hold him accountable. And I was like, damn it. You're right. So I went right back upstairs and I was like, sorry, bud, not happening. You got to go. You can do hard things. You can push through. We'll take a nap later. This is something you want. And we're not going to let you already not necessarily give up, but not give it your best shot. And that ended up being really important to him. And I feel like he really learned a great lesson that week. Because even then, the next couple days, he was showing up late. And I'm like, yeah, and how do you feel about that? How's the response from your coaches? And he realized that that's not what he wanted either. And he completely shifted that on his own without us even having to push him any more than we did just that very first time. So to me, that's a healthy push too.
Absolutely. That set the tone for, the rest of football and the rest of the practices and workouts. And
yeah, it paid off. And I think the biggest thing though is just as parents listening to your intuition and listening to your gut, because you'll know when it's a time to push and when it's a time to not. And I like to say that because I always like to remind parents, don't listen to society. Don't do things just because that's how it was done for you. What are you feeling? What's your intuition saying?
At the end of the day, we know our children best. Mm-hmm. So definitely trust whatever it is that your gut's telling you, or whatever your instincts are telling you to do. Definitely go with that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. So in that struggle of knowing when to push your kids and when not to push your kids, how do you think you've moved through that? Is it just constantly learning? Is it me in your ear all the time?
No, it's a constant learning curve. And it just takes patience. I mean, kind of taking a step back from the situation. And for me personally, instead of naturally just saying man up or get over it or dry up your tears, take a step back and really shift your perspective on why and what is happening.
Do you just naturally do that though? Do you just naturally step back and shift your
always.
perspective?
Not always.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard sometimes.
It is hard, especially or even when you're in it all the time. And I always am talking about perspective shifts. You got to call me out sometimes and tell me like, hey.
Yeah, no, it's hard. Naturally, we are who we are, and we only want to see our perspective and how we're feeling in that moment and what we see through our eyes. And it's most important to see all sides of the coin.
And then teaching our kids to see those different perspectives too.
Absolutely. And allowing that vulnerability. And like parents, I feel like sometimes tend to be the boss, and they treat their kids like employees, and what I say goes. And
yeah,
either like, in terms of emotions, hey, get over it and move on. Like there is no openness or no perspective or seeing your kid's point of view and why they're feeling the way that they are.
Well, and that's because that's how we were raised.
Exactly.
And it's no fault of our parents because that's how they were raised.
Yeah.
And it just kind of trickles down.
Yeah, it's a generational issue for sure.
And now here we are the generation that gets to figure that out, which is like messy work.
Yeah.
It's messy and it's hard. And then we get to teach our kids that, which is great. But yeah, it's a lot. I'm going to shift gears now to self-care. Men's self-care. Do you do self-care?
Yes, but honestly, it's limited. The amount of time that I spend working, housework, kids sports, dealing with things around the house, and just common chores. I definitely put the self-care probably on the back burner more than I should. But when I do, I enjoy basketball. I enjoy quiet time. Occasionally going out for a beer with a friend, or going to dinner, or watching a football game, or something along those lines. Just anything that is a change of scenery or change in my environment is usually a good form of self-care for me personally. Yeah,
well, we know how important it is for us to take time for ourselves. You typically encourage me to do that a lot, to go take a bath and stuff. I think it's because you can see the difference when I do that. I can see the difference for you too, though. I don't want to speak for you, but I think one of the best things that you do for yourself is when you go away on a trip. And you've done that once a year, 2 years in a row. And we were just talking about the other day how I feel like that needs to be a normal thing for you. Because when you get out and go away and explore, you come home and you're so refreshed and relaxed.
Yeah, it's very important for, I would say, any relationship to have that freedom and that confidence to not feel guilty to go do something or to enjoy yourself alone. Correct.
With your people or even by yourself.
Even to this day, if I go on those trips that you mentioned, it kind of takes me a couple days to ease into it because I feel so guilty.
How do you feel guilty?
I feel guilty leaving you in the trenches, taking grenades while I'm off having a good time.
I felt guilty whenever I first started traveling a lot, when I was in my previous job and had to travel a lot. And I felt bad. I knew that the kids missed me, and I hated that. But I also just, I don't know. I know how important it is.
Absolutely.
So we're talking about self-care, but I want to talk about the healing journey for a man to be able to feel confident and comfortable starting a healing journey. So I actually polled the audience on my Instagram, and I specifically asked, what do you think keeps men from starting a healing journey? So I wanted to read to you some of the responses I got. And it's basically everything we've said. Everyone said almost the same thing. Societal pressure, being told that it's a sign of weakness, pride.
Yeah, and I can absolutely relate to that. And I'm sure most men, if not all men, can relate to all those answers.
So how do we change it?
I think it starts with parenting in the household, teaching, whether it's a girl or a boy, just teaching them that it is okay to be vulnerable. It is okay to express feelings. It is okay to have an open line of communication where a child is comfortable coming to you for whatever issue they may be going through. And just knowing that we as parents are constantly learning just as well as the kids.
I totally agree with that. I think I will add to it and say that the way we also can change it is as wives and sisters and friends, encouraging the guys around us to take time for themselves, to find a path for healing. If you can see that, I think other guys talking about going through a healing journey is going to really encourage more to want to jump on board and do that as well.
Absolutely. For the record, I 100% support all wives allowing their husbands more free time to do whatever it is that they enjoy. But in all seriousness, if someone's going through something, whether it's emotional or physical or whatever it may be, just don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone and go get that help that you need. It's much better than the alternative.
And honestly, not just if you're feeling some sort of hurt or struggle, if you're just not happy in your life, you can make a shift.
Change it.
Yeah, men and women. That's not just for one or the other. That's for everybody. If you're not happy, you do have a choice. You can make a change. You're not stuck where you are.
Agreed. And if you as a father or a husband are suffering, odds are your family is also suffering. And
that's a really good point.
That may be really hard to see, but at the end of the day, it's not just us that are suffering. It affects everyone that we love and everyone that's close to us.
What a good point.
I know.
Well, thank you for doing this with me. I know was it out of your comfort zone?
It was, but you made it a little easier.
Oh.
Work hard and be nice to people.
I gotta change that sign.
I've been wanting to say that this whole time because I've been staring at it. But
well, I appreciate you stepping out of your comfort zone for me. And I think that the things that you had to say are really valuable and could possibly help somebody.
I hope so. At the very least, I hope it was enjoyable.
All right, friends, that's it for this episode of Courageous Conversations. Thank you so much for listening. Be sure to subscribe and share this with a friend. Bye now.
Could you hear that?